Thank you. And Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, has just started delivering this speech in Sydney at this Asia Link event, outlining essentially his views ahead of heading to this big international conference, the G20. Let's go to that now.
As Treasurer, I'm pretty sure he qualified for foreign resident tax status for a fairly long period of time, and he may well still to this day. I'm not sure. You'll have to ask his accountant. But that's only, I think, a demonstration of just how much time Andrew spent on the road and continues to this day promoting our incredible opportunities and our linkages and the friendships that we have. Friendships that Andrew developed prior to coming into politics, being in politics, friendships that are genuine and deep and that have been maintained regardless of what role he has performed. Now today, and thank you also to Bloomberg. This has always been a great forum to present at, which I've taken advantage of on many opportunities and in various roles. So I very much thank Bloomberg for the opportunity again to be here today for that long journey from a few floors down. I want to talk today about our plan to foster an open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific, consistent with our national interests. And I want to set out the principles consistent with our national values that will govern and guide my government's engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. Why? Because the Indo-Pacific is where we live. It's where we have our greatest influence and can make the most meaningful impact and contribution. It's the region that will continue to shape our prosperity, our security and our destiny. It's the region, together with our allies, and especially the United States, where our people made great sacrifice, where our peace was threatened. It's the region that has accounted for 2/3 of global growth over the last decade. It is home to more than half the world's population. It's the destination for more than 3/4 of our two-way trade. It embraces our Pacific family, with whom we have a special relationship and responsibility, our close neighbours, our major trading partners, our alliance partners, and the world's fastest growing economies. And on that note, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. It's great to have you here, Michael. Thank you very much. So where else would we want to be as Australians? Where else would Australia want to be? During the early years of our nation, our geography seemed to be quite a burden. But today I think we can appreciate now that it has proved to be an enormous blessing. While comfortably understated in our approach, consistent with who we are as Australians, we do not, though, underestimate our influence, especially if we choose to focus and target our contributions where we can have the greatest impact. Our economy has grown faster than any other advanced economy over the last 28 years. Australia is alone amongst advanced economies in enjoying uninterrupted growth over this period. We are one of only 10 countries globally with a AAA credit rating from all key agencies. We host 10,000 foreign-owned businesses and $3.7 trillion in foreign investment. We rank 3rd as a destination for foreign students and 7th as a tourist destination. We play a critical role in underpinning the resource, energy and food security of East Asia. We are the 4th largest pension market. Our funds management sector is the 6th largest in the world. We are a standard bearer for democracy and the rule of law. We are a staunch and active ally of the United States, deepening our security cooperation to help secure our region. Our post-war trading relationship with Japan, which was marked by, in particular, the commerce agreement secured by the Menzies government back in 1957, saw Japan then become ultimately our largest trading partner until just over a decade ago. The relationship with Japan is now broader and deeper than ever before. And this weekend, Prime Minister Abe will preside over the G20 as a great friend of Australia and one of the region's most highly respected statesmen. We share a comprehensive strategic partnership and free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, with a broad and deepening relationship underpinned, in particular, by people-to-people ties. And that's evidenced by the fact that we are home to 1.2 million ethnic Chinese and a host to 1.4 million Chinese visitors each year and 205,000 Chinese students each year. People-to-people connections with China. The growth in India's economic and strategic heft is increasingly felt beyond the Indian Ocean, creating new opportunities for Australia based on our shared values and outlook with India. It is now our single largest source of permanent migrants to Australia. And our special relationship with ASEAN, since its inception, has plugged Australia into a critical network of independent and dynamic developing economies who are working together to create their own norms and rules for inter-regional trade growth, critical to the interests of all countries in the Indo Pacific. And we are the largest single development partner with the island nations of the Pacific. So that's quite a scorecard. And together in our region, we obviously share a future. We have much to contribute and we have much to gain. The Indo-Pacific, I would argue, is a region that has undergone and is undergoing profound change. We have helped shape that change. Post-war social development and economic prosperity, global engagement with the People's Republic of China, and the resultant economic miracle of China's economic advancement. The emergence of ASEAN, which has supported regional stability, allowed its members to prosper. The burgeoning of inter-regional trade, the build-up of regional security capabilities, and the inevitable tensions in some areas that arise from that. The economic liberation that has flowed from free trade, new technologies and innovation. New environmental pressures and threats to our climate, our oceans, our species, our forests that have no regard for lines on a map. The confluence, agglomeration and dynamism of all of these forces is now shaping our region and I believe has brought us to a new threshold point. Undoubtedly, the most significant change in recent times has been the shift in the relationship between the United States and China, who exert the greatest influence on our region, but more broadly across the world. The world's most important bilateral relationship, the US-China relationship, is clearly strained. Trade tensions have escalated. The collateral damage is spreading. The global trading system is under real pressure. Global growth projections are being wound back. The impact of any further deterioration of that relationship will not be limited to those two major powers. The balance between strategic engagement and strategic competition in the US-China relationship has shifted. But this was inevitable. We shouldn't be surprised about this. China's conscious and right decision to pursue prosperity as a strategy for national unity and stability launched what has truly been one of the world's greatest economic miracles. Now China is a significant power with vast military global interests and the biggest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. It is important to acknowledge that this success, though, was made possible by the active and strategic engagement of the United States and the wider global community. Firstly, through an enthusiastic bilateral exchange, began in the 70s, and then by supporting access to the global rules-based trading system through China's accession to the WTO in 2001, which gave it much better access to the markets of 154 member economies. Now, this also required that process reforms from China, economic reforms, that also supported its economic expansion. China is now the major trading partner of more than 50 countries, including Australia. In 1980, China's trade with the outside world amounted to less than 40 billion. By 2015, it had increased 100-fold to 4 trillion. China is the largest holder of foreign US currency reserves. China's economic rise, though, has not been a zero-sum game or just for China. This has especially been true in Australia's case, but also for the United States. That is why Australia has always and will continue to welcome China's economic growth and the things that lead to that. However, The ground, as I've said, is shifting and has shifted. It is now evident that the United States believes that the rules-based trading system in its current form is not capable of dealing with China's economic structure and policy practices. And many of those concerns are legitimate and are shared by Australia. Forced technology transfer is not fair. Intellectual property theft cannot be justified, regardless of where it's done. Industrial subsidies, under the model, do promote overproduction. China's rise has now reached also what I describe a threshold level of economic maturity. That was the point. That was the objective. While we acknowledge that certainly large parts of China are still to realise that prosperity, it is also true that its most significant and most successful provinces, some of which are much larger, in fact many of which are much larger than many developed nations, including Australia, has reached and even exceeds the economic sophistication of its global competitors. Now, that's something that should be celebrated. That's something that should be acknowledged. But that comes with some new responsibilities, because at the same time, those economies are competing with others with concessions, whether they be on trade or environmental obligations or other terms that are not available to those countries with which they're competing. So our current trading system seems not capable really of acknowledging this, and let alone resolving these issues. These are not offered as criticisms, they're basically just offered as a simple assessment and observation of what's just there. The rules-based system is obviously then in need of urgent repair if it is to adequately respond to these new challenges, including the rise of large emerging economies and changing patterns of trade and emerging technologies. So our prosperity, and that of all those nations of the Indo Pacific, depends strongly then on maintaining an open global economy and a rules-based trading system. But I'd say, as Prime Minister Lee did recently, that needs some modernisation in order to cope with it. It's based on norms and assumptions set decades and decades ago. It will also depend on a positive, productive and cooperative bilateral relationship between China and the United States. That is a prerequisite, really, to get this sorted. And that will require what I describe as the exercise of special responsibilities of these great and significant powers to resist a narrow view of just their own interests. And I would say that it won't be the first time that's been required of great powers and significant powers, and it's not the first time that such responsibilities have been demonstrated in the past. In 1951, George Kennan wrote in American Diplomacy, "If our purposes and undertakings here at home are decent ones, unsullied by arrogance or hostility towards other people or delusions of superiority, then the pursuit of our national interests can never fail to be conducive to a better world." 1951. That statement was made at a time when the United States was in the process of building a new world order, with institutions and common rules unashamedly seeking to secure prosperity as a bulwark against what I can only describe as the madness that saw 60 million people killed and slaughtered, including 45 million civilians during the Second World War. And according to some estimates, that included up to 20 million Chinese. And we know from our estimates, 419,000 Americans and almost 40,000 Australians. They're sobering figures. This new world order was the dividend of the peace that was bravely won, none more so by the United States. And of course, Australia and allies played a very big part. And they understood that with that great power that came from that, required great responsibility of them. Now, the principles of this new order reflected the values and aspirations of its architects. It was also informed, I would stress, by the failures of the pre-war institutions and mindsets that saw emerging and recovering economies become frustrated, giving rise to the most evil of nationalist ideologies to take hold. And we all know where that ended. So as I joined other leaders a little while ago in Portsmouth to commemorate D-Day, I must admit it was one of those times when I was absolutely overwhelmed by the moment. I was sitting at the luncheon beside Chancellor Merkel, and I just was inspired by how far we'd come. And it was no different to the very profound feeling I had when I joined Prime Minister Abe at Darwin to commemorate the bombing of our northern capital. These were quite significant, I think, moments. The post-war world order has achieved some truly extraordinary outcomes. Sometimes we give ourselves too hard a time, I think, on where things are at today. When you're sitting there reflecting back on people who are about to get on boats and storm beaches 75 years ago, we've come a long way. The United States deserves great credit for that achievement in the exercise of their special responsibilities. And central to these institutions has been a respect for the individual sovereign state, no matter how large or how small, and the ambition that each may be able to engage and participate with the security afforded by a common set of rules that means they can get a fair go, free of coercion. And like any nation, the United States is not perfect, but it does have form in being able to look beyond its own horizon and to see a bigger picture. The United States has demonstrated an understanding that the responsibilities of great power are exercised in their restraint, freely subjecting itself to higher order rules, their accommodation of other interests, and indeed their benevolence. Such power supports the independence and sovereignty of other nation states and affords protection beyond its own interests in the knowledge that this is necessary to maintain the peace and stability that ultimately underpins their own prosperity. They have skin in that game. The level of global interconnectedness today means this has never been more true. As a rising global power, China also now has these additional responsibilities. The two go together. It is a mark of how far they themselves have come. It is therefore important that the US-China trade tensions are resolved in this broader context of these special and additional power responsibilities in a way that is, of course, WTO consistent and does not undermine the interests of other parties, including Australia. The accumulation of issues that have led to these tensions must be acknowledged. They must be addressed. They must be resolved at the negotiating table in a way that reinforces open and inclusive global trading systems. And like all of us, China and the US have a strong interest and a special responsibility to modernise and support the system that has delivered unprecedented growth in national wealth and living standards over particularly the last 2 decades. Now, we can support these efforts and outcomes by rejecting what I call the fatalism of increased polarisation, and by resisting the analyses that only sees all of these issues through a binary prism. It's in no one's interest in the Indo Pacific to see an inevitably more competitive US-China relationship become more adversarial in character. All nations in our region, not just Australia, are having to adjust to this period of great power competition. Japan, India, New Zealand, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Australia. All of us are similarly seeking to balance our interests, our history, our geography, our alliances, our partnerships and aspirations in the context of this new dynamic. Not easy. Like others who live here, Australia simply seeks the freedom to be ourselves, to peacefully pursue our national interests, consistent with our values, appreciating our history and being transparent and honest about our aspirations for the future. Seems fair enough. These shared challenges, I think, provide some very important common ground amongst nations in the Indo-Pacific, which is where I do see Australia and our government continuing to play an important role. So, won't be fazed, intimidated, or fatalistic. Of course, the international environment is difficult. Of course, there are risks of further deterioration. Being positive doesn't undermine or reject that assessment. That can happen in these key relationships. And of course, there are consequential collateral impacts of the global economy and our regional stability. Of course, there are also pressures that some describe as the decoupling of the Chinese and American economic systems, whether this be in technology, payment systems, financial services, other areas. But these are not insurmountable obstacles. To think they are not does not amount to some form of modern appeasement. That's just a straw man argument, which I'm happy to discard. And frankly, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? These risks not only can be managed and mitigated, but they must be. And this becomes more possible when we get this and we work together. So we should just not sit back, passively await our fate, cut to the car chase in the wake of a major power contest. This underestimates, I think, and gives up worse on the power of human state and multilateral agency, which has demonstrated, as I think I've already argued, to produce some pretty significant outcomes over the last 75 years. There are practical steps that we can pursue, and so we will play our part. We will not be passive bystanders. Our approach will be based on our key principles, commitment to open markets with trade relationships based on rules, not coercion, an approach which builds resilience and sovereignty, respect for international law, and the resolution of disputes peacefully without the threat or use of coercive power, a commitment to cooperation and burden sharing within strong and resilient regional architectures. None of those principles is inconsistent with the natural instinct of sovereign nations to compete. And it is not inevitable that competition leads to conflict. We have already demonstrated that like-minded nations can take measures to help shape their own destiny. So we will continue in Australia to lead by example, developing our close web of relationships across and within the Indo-Pacific. And in recent years, we have been investing heavily in our major bilateral relationships to advance our security and prosperity and build regional influence. We've been encouraging regional economic integration and cooperation. We've been promoting rules and norms to guide peaceful cooperation. We're stepping up our economic engagement. Our defence cooperation is stronger than it's ever been. We are leading collaboration on issues at the frontier of a changing world like e-commerce, cybersecurity, infrastructure development, innovation, technology, maritime security. We are working more closely than ever before with close partners like Japan, India, Indonesia, Vietnam. Our special strategic relationship with Japan is based on deep shared values, interests and beliefs. Prime Minister Abe has a vision to strengthen the international order. And his leadership of the G20 this week, I think, will put that on show at the dawn of a new Rewa era. He'll demonstrate that. My government is enhancing our partnership with India, one also underpinned by shared values, a plan to bring economic relationship to a new level and a common strategic outlook. We are committed to leading security, economic and development partners for Southeast Asia. Our vision for the Indo-Pacific has ASEAN at its core. We have continued to push ahead with an ambitious trade agenda that has rallied the region and sustained momentum for trade liberalisation. Under Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership, we concluded major trade deals by this bloke, by Andrew Robb leading the charge, with China, with Japan and South Korea. When the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, understandably, that was the position President Trump took to the election. We rightly pressed ahead under Malcolm Turnbull's Prime Ministership. It was the biggest trade deal since the birth of the WTO and a positive affirmation of middle power diplomacy. There is now strong interest in the TPP-11 from nations both inside and outside of the Asia Pacific. And this year we hope to conclude the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, an agreement that includes 16 economies and accounts for about 1/3 of global GDP. It would be the first regional free trade agreement to include India and has the 10 nations of ASEAN at its core. RCEP's membership includes 10 out of Australia's top 15 trading partners, accounts for over 60% of Australia's two-way trade and over 70% of Australia's goods and services exports. So to conclude the agreement, when leaders meet in Bangkok in November of this year, I would urge, and I've certainly tasked our minister to this end, to send their trade ministers next month to Beijing with a clear mandate to deal so we can get this done by the end of this year. There are other priority initiatives that will add ballast to regional relationships. Australia strongly supports Indonesian President Widodo's vision and leadership in developing ASEAN's outlook on the Indo Pacific. Our recently concluded Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with Indonesia is another major step to securing Australia's economic future and to strengthen our critical relationship with our largest neighbour. And while continuing to work with partners in the region, we will also deal directly with our great and significant and powerful friends in the region. Our relationship with the United States has never been stronger. Ours is a resolute and mutually beneficial alliance partnership where neither party has the need to prove anything to each other re our commitment to that relationship. Our alliance with the US is the bedrock of Australia's security, providing us with irreplaceable hard power capabilities and intelligence. Australia is a stronger regional power because of our alliance with the United States. We're committed to working with the US internationally because we agree it has borne too many burdens on its own, and Australia will always continue to pull its weight. And we will work with the US as well as Japan, Indonesia, China, the EU and others to reform international institutions, including the WTO, to ensure they're fit for purpose and serve their members' interests, because we will be more secure and prosperous in a global order based on agreed rules, not one based on the exercise of power alone. My government is also committed to further enhancing our relationship with China. Our relationship with China has so many strengths. Our trading relationship is flourishing, with two-way trade reaching a remarkable $215 billion in 2018, which benefits both countries. Our cooperation with China through our comprehensive strategic partnership goes well beyond economic issues and deals. We're working together across fields including health, education, taxation, where Australians offer world-class expertise. We're working together in the Pacific. We've also been cooperating successfully to counter drug trafficking through Task Force Blaze. And there is much more we can do on these positive agendas. That's why we established the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations early this year. The foundation will strengthen areas where we already cooperate, deepen the already rich links across our communities, and help identify new areas for practical cooperation. And I particularly want to acknowledge, because he's here today, but I would otherwise, the chair of the foundation, Warwick Smith. And I want to thank Warwick very much for his leadership, but not just on this initiative, but over a long period of time in our relationship with China. And while we will be clear-eyed that our political differences will affect aspects of our engagement, that's to be expected, we are determined that our relationship not be dominated by areas of disagreement. The decisions we make in relation to China, of course, are based solely on our national interest, just as China's are towards Australia. And these are sometimes hard calls that are made, but they are always designed and always to leave large scope for cooperation on common interests and to recognise the importance of China's success. The success is good for China and it is very good for Australia. McKinsey estimates that some 2.6% of consumption in the rest of the world is imported from China, compared with 0.8% in 2000. So it's pretty obvious. Chinese imports now account for 2% of gross output of the rest of the world, compared with 0.4% in 2000. So we welcome that. We welcome Chinese investing. We have always welcomed it for decades. This is not new. The stock of Chinese investment in Australia in 2018 was more than 8 times larger than it was a decade ago. But it is not our single largest investor. It ranks behind the United States, Japan, UK, the Netherlands. It is growing, but these other nations remain the dominant stock of investment in Australia. Australia has the most liberal foreign investment regime in our region. It is not possible for Australia to invest in China in the way Chinese investments are made here, and perhaps that will change someday. But our policy is not framed on some context of reciprocity. It's defined on our national interest. We retain sovereignty, as all would expect, over all of these investments, especially in relation to strategic and national security considerations. But where such issues are satisfied, we would be mugs. Mugs, only harming our own economic interests if we were to deny our economy access to this capital. That is why we operate a non-discriminatory approach to investment screening. And investment screening is not exclusive to Australia. It's done by many countries, most in fact, including China. The infrastructure needs of our region are also enormous, and Australia welcomes the contribution that Belt and Road Initiative can make to regional infrastructure, investment and to regional development. We support regional investments with commercial merit that meet genuine market need and international standards, including on transparency and debt sustainability. Finally, a key pillar of our Indo-Pacific engagement is our Pacific Step Up. And I'm so pleased to see how well that is received and supported, as we've seen in the Lowy survey today, by the Australian people. We have returned the Pacific to where it should be, front and centre of Australia's strategic outlook, our foreign policy and our personal connections, and particularly with our ODA program. This is where we have special responsibilities of what I've described as our Pacific family, our Vavale, our Wantok, our Whanau. It is a fundamental building block of our engagement with the Indo-Pacific. A South Pacific that is secure strategically, stable economically, independent and sovereign politically. It is where Australia can make the biggest difference through our initiatives, including the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, our labour market programs and undersea cable projects, for example. A strong, stable region keeps us more secure and enables our economies to grow and our peoples to prosper. So today I've focused principally on the economic dimensions of our regional relationships and engagement strategy. On other occasions, I will address these issues from the perspective of our strategic security and defence interests, but also in turn from the perspective of our environmental objectives and our development cooperation objectives, which are equally important. I've done so consistent, though, with the priority I have assigned on building our economy to secure the future of Australians, as I put to the people at the last election. But for today, let me close by making the following observations, very briefly. There are gathering clouds in the global economy. The trading relationship between the world's two most important economies is under serious strain. But an ever-worsening trajectory in this relationship is not inevitable. We all have responsibilities to deepen patterns of cooperation, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Australia is ready to play its part. We embrace free trade, global engagement, and an international system where we agree rules, stick to them, and always honour our commitments. That is the surest path to an open, stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your attention.